Before we start writing any code, let's take a look around the directory structure. This is going to cement where everything lives, so it's going to be a lot easier later when you start to get into writing some real code. So let's start with the Bootstrap folder just here. Now this Bootstrap app file is called from the public directory, and the public directory is the public facing folder of your application. That just means that when you deploy this to a production server or when you're running this locally, everything points to public, which means that all of this is outside of public access. So these are the only files that can be accessed publicly. If we open up index.php, you can see here that this is requiring in Composer's autoloader, which will pull in all of the dependencies that Laravel needs to run, and it will pull in this Bootstrap app file, and it will basically create the application for us. So we don't really need to day-to-day dive into this Bootstrap app file unless you have some very specific requirements, but I thought I'd cover that just so you know what that is. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's head over to the storage directory. This is not, again, something that you're probably not going to come into on a day-to-day basis, but this will store any application logs. So if anything is logged to your files, if there are any errors, these will appear in here. There's nothing in here yet because we've not really run anything. And we've got framework cache, sessions, testing, and views as well, which will mainly be cached things or stored things. For example, when we start looking at signing users in, this will store sessions by default in this folder. And the same with app as well. App's more a general storage area for when you're maybe uploading files, creating temporary files, and all that kind of stuff. But again, diving into storage is not something that you'll do day to day. Now, the kind of entry point to our application are our roots. When we create out new pages, we define our roots here, which either have a closure to do something. In this case, it's returning a welcome view, which we'll talk about later, which is exactly what you see here. But this is where you'll define any pages in your application or roots. So you would define them out here and link them up to potentially a controller, which we'll also be covering in the course. Now, there are three other files in here which we're not going to be touching. These are for API development, so if you wanted to create API endpoints, you would list these in here, and they work slightly differently. They have different middleware attached to them and all that kind of stuff. We also have channels as well, which is for Laravel's broadcasting real-time functionality, which allows you to create a channel that you can broadcast messages on and listen for on the front end. And again, we're not going to be covering that in this course because it's a little bit out of the scope of the very basics. Now the console here is where we can register artisan commands. We've already briefly spoke about artisan, so we'll come back to that a little bit later. But we have a web root here which is returning a welcome view. So let's try and find out where that lives. If we head over to the resources directory, think of this as your kind of front end assets. So things like CSS, JavaScript, language, which are translations within Laravel, and views as well. And you can see here, sure enough, that welcome view by default ships with Laravel, and that contains pretty much everything that you see on that page. So it's just a very, very simple setup with Laravel's default skeleton. So if we head over to the config directory, this is pretty self-explanatory. This is where all of our configuration lives. Laravel has lots of default configuration, which just makes sense for a application that you've just built. And we have things like our app name. Now within the Laravel framework and within what you build, you'll reference the configuration every so often, and this uses this env function which actually reads from our environment variables. Now our env file is incredibly important. This is what we port over to different environments. So on a local environment we have, for example, app debug set to true, which means that if an error happens within the application, we will see a stack trace of the error and we'll be able to debug it while we are building it. We also have things like the app env local, which controls how other things work in the framework. If you were to push this to a production environment, you'd more than likely turn app debug to false, and you would just have a separate env file which this is controlled by. Now if we head over to that config again, you can see this env function is reading from our environment variables, but it's providing a default. So if you see env within your config, that's exactly what that means. You can go ahead and browse through the config, but most of these are out of the scopes of the very basics, so we won't be looking at them too much. Now we also have a database folder here which contains factories, migrations, and seeders. We're going to be covering migrations in this course, and migrations are a concept where we can create a class, much like this, to bring a table up, e.g. create a table within our database, and then do something on the down migration as well. This is like version control for your database. So we tell this how to create a database or how to modify a database table, and we have a down method which effectively reverts the changes. So we'll be creating some migrations later so we can see how this works. We also have factories, which are classes which allow us to generate fake data for particular models. And this really helps when we are testing or if you just want to generate out a load of information. And with that, we have seeders. So our database seeder will basically allow us to run our seeds, e.g. create lots of users, either for testing purposes or just to check how things look when you're listing through data. But again, we're going to cover migrations. We're not going to touch factories or seeders just yet. Now, I spoke a little bit about testing. Laravel has really nice testing framework built in. So you can go ahead and explore this. And when you start writing tests, you can create tests out. But that is where all of your tests will live. Okay, so we've covered all of these outside parts, which the only things we'll probably really touch are the database, resources, and routes day to day. But if we look in this app directory, this is the kind of domain of our application. So if we open up the HTTP directory, we have this controllers directory, which is where either manually or via the artisan console, we can create controllers, which are classes which respond to our route. So we'll be creating some of them a little bit later. And we also have this middleware. So we've got quite a few pieces of middleware already in this application for things like checking if a user is authenticated or not, which we'll be covering in another course. So middleware, if you're not familiar, are like layers through to the core of your application. We can choose a middleware stack that we want to run through, and this typically modifies the request or changes the behavior of accessing a particular page. And again, we'll look at that a little bit later. And where all of our middleware is registered is in this kernel. So we have global middleware just here. We have middleware that's specific to web routes and specific to API routes, because API and web work differently in terms of whether we're using cookies. For example, we've got a piece of middleware which encrypts cookies, working with PHP sessions. APIs are stateless, so we don't need this kind of middleware in our API routes. And we also have route middleware, which is named middleware, which allows us to attach this to routes or within controllers, and we'll be covering that later as well. We also have this models directory. So let's say we wanted to create a new post and have a list of posts that belong to a user. If we use the command line, by default, our post model would be created in here, and we could generate a migration alongside of that to create the database table. So everything is very quick. And as always, we're going to be covering that through the course as well. Now, the providers directory is essentially a list of service providers which allow you to either register things within Laravel's container or just boot any services up that you need. So if you have a kind of general thing that you need to do within your application, if you're putting in a third-party package, sometimes you'll need to use service providers to do that. Again, we're not going to be covering that in this course, but we are going to be covering a lot more, and we really just want to get up and running so we can start writing some code. We also have this console directory where any console commands live, and we can register these here and we can schedule them as well. So we can schedule commands to run at specific times as long as we have a cron job set up. And we also have this exceptions directory, which by default just has a handler in here. And this basically just works out how to handle different errors. And you really only want to touch this if you want to modify how default errors work within Laravel. Okay, so that's pretty much it for all of these folders. Let's take a look at a couple of the files in here. So let's open composer.json. If you're new to Composer, Composer is a dependency manager for PHP. And all this file is doing is it's telling us what we want to require into this kind of scaffolded app. And that is, of course, we're making sure we have the right PHP version. We're, of course, pulling in the Laravel framework, which is a completely separate package to what we've just pulled down. So we'll have specific Laravel framework files inside of our vendor folder, which we don't want to touch. And we have a couple of other things as well here, like Laravel Tinker, which is a command line application for Laravel, which allows us to run code effectively within our app. And we have a couple of other things here, like cross-origin request sharing. So we're not going to cover that, but that's something for a later date. So this is the composer.json file. There's quite a lot in here, but you probably won't need to touch this unless you're doing something very specific. That's pretty much what that does. Okay, so another thing that's worth noting is the package.json file and the webpack.mix.js file. Laravel ships with this webpack file, which will basically compile all of your JavaScript and all of your CSS. So for example, if you're using Sass, you could use Laravel to compile everything into the public directory so it's viewable. We're not going to cover that, but that is something that you can do. And the package.json file just pulls down any of the development dependencies that are required for your JavaScript. We've also got things in the root directory like artisan, which is the console command that we've just run. So this will boot everything up and then it will allow you to run artisan. Again, we won't need to touch this file unless we are making any kind of modifications to this, which we shouldn't really be doing. So that just about covers this. Hopefully that's given you a good idea as to what goes where. But as you start to write code in Laravel and you start diving into these different folders and files, you'll get up to scratch with getting used to where everything is pretty quickly.